Hi, Govan, and welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and I've been shocked at the number of people who have commented in recent days on my video about The Lord of the Rings being a Christian book, and people saying, no, it's actually not, it's pagan, or it's witchcraft, or it's whatever, and I'm like, man, I really thought this should have been a dead topic. But just to add some more fuel to the fire and some more evidence to my side of the equation, there is a theme which runs throughout The Lord of the Rings, which is a very Christian theme indeed, which is the theme of humility being a virtue. Christianity is almost unique among the world's religions in this respect. There's not a whole lot of religions in the world, especially historically, that place such a huge emphasis on humility. But in Christianity, it's everywhere. I mean, especially in Jesus's ministry in the Gospels, you can see many references to the idea that you should be humble. And one of the more famous sayings that Jesus said is that those who are lowly will be exalted, but those who are proud will be humbled. And Tolkien does that exact thing a lot in The Lord of the Rings. There are a lot of proud characters who get humbled, and there are a lot of humble characters who get very exalted. So I'm going to look at some of those today. Not all of them, because that would require way too much time, but some of the key examples, but also some of the examples that are a little more unexpected or out of the way, just to show how deeply ingrained this idea is in The Lord of the Rings. And that is, as I said, further evidence that Tolkien was very much writing this with a Christian frame of mind. So let's start with some of the obvious examples. The first and most obvious example is Samwise Gamgee. He is pretty much the epitome of a humble person who ends up being highly exalted. He starts the story as a gardener, literally, like he's a servant to another person in the Shire. And hobbits in and of themselves are, in a lot of ways, not humble in the sense of having the virtue of humility, but certainly humble in the sense of there's nothing grandiose about them. Some of them, like the Sackville Bagginses, may have aspirations, but that's a different story. Most hobbits have really no aspirations to anything grand or great, and Sam certainly doesn't. But by the end of the story, of course, he is one of the most highly exalted characters in all of Middle-earth, because after the success of the mission at Mount Doom, and Sam and Frodo wake up, they are brought before the now King Aragorn, who literally tells everybody at the Field of Cormallin to praise them with great praise. And he bows in front of them. This is not exactly the way it goes down in the movie. The movie echoes this moment, certainly, where Aragorn says, "My friends, you bow to no one," and then everybody bows to the hobbits. But it's the same kind of moment in the book, except it's even more explicit that they are praising Frodo and Sam. Merry and Pippin aren't there. Well, actually they are, but they're not with Frodo and Sam up on the dais being praised. They're kind of playing different roles. But the idea here is that Sam is one of two characters who is so exalted that the king of the now reunited kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor, and the greatest monarch left in Middle-earth now that Sauron has been defeated, is literally bowing down to them. And Sam, of course, is, from the humble beginnings of a gardener to this position, is like, that's the ultimate exaltation of the humble. Frodo is a very similar case, though not as extreme, because Frodo, though he doesn't start as a gardener, he starts as kind of a landed gentry type of person, he's still a humble character. He does display the virtue of humility. He never, tries to just have his own way about things. Of course, when the ring starts corrupting him, he has his issues. But as a character who he really is, he's not like that. He is very content to take advice from other people because he knows he's not smart as well versed in Middle-earth as other people are. He doesn't know the history. He doesn't know a lot of things. And so there are lots of moments in the story where we can see Frodo's humility shine through. And as I said, it's not as extreme as Sam's because he doesn't start as literally like a servant. it's still the case that he is a humble character, even if not as lowly, who, as a result of the quest, becomes highly exalted in much the same way that Sam does. So those two cases are kind of the most obvious, and Sam's is the more extreme, but there are plenty of others. One obvious contrasting example, so that we can actually see a good example of the proud being humbled, would be Theoden and Denethor. Denethor doesn't get humbled so much as he ends up just bringing about his own destruction, but it's a good example of how pride leads to bad things. Theoden and Denethor can be compared and contrasted in so many ways. They are screaming to be paralleled, basically, because each one of them has a hobbit in his service, and each one of them is the lord of one of the greater free people's kingdoms left in Middle-earth, and their trajectories are basically in opposite directions. Theoden goes from being completely almost corrupted, or not corrupted so much as just deceived by Saruman via Grima Wormtongue, and Denethor starts as, being resisting to the corrupting influence of Sauron, but nevertheless ends up being fooled by him, whereas Theoden is healed by Gandalf and goes on to be a great hero again. One of the key aspects to Theoden's character, though, is not simply that he turns himself around and becomes, once again the great warrior leader that his people need him to be, but he also displays humility, unlike Denethor, who doesn't really display any at all. Theoden is humble in the sense that he, once he kind of turns around, he asks Gandalf's advice. He doesn't just go, okay, well, I know exactly what to do and nobody's going to tell me otherwise. That's not to say that he doesn't have moments after this point where he has issues, because he does still have kind of the lingering effects. At one point he will say, Gandalf's advice doesn't seem so good right now. And Aragorn tells him, well, don't judge it just yet. But he does ask for Gandalf's advice. He is not rejecting the help or advice of others. He is perfectly willing to understand that his position in everything is not, I'm the man and everybody's got to do what I say because I'm king. Although it kind of starts that way in a indirect sense, because there is that whole scene at the doors of Meduseld where Aragorn has to give up on Duril, and Aragorn has a bit of a maybe pride moment, but maybe just like, dude, this sword is way too important to hand over to other people. It's whatever it is. Theoden has declared, really it's, kind of Wormtongue, but it's, nobody gets to come in here with a sword. Which is, not exactly a completely out of place rule. It's, you're entering the hall of the king. It would perhaps be expected that you wouldn't bear any weapons in there. But that kind of turns around where, after that point, of course, there's no longer any issues between Theoden and anybody else. And throughout the rest of Theoden's arc, he is kind of accepting of his role, which he knows, and this kind of goes to northern courage more than humility, he knows is likely to result in his own death, because he knows that the forces that are arrayed against them are so overwhelming that they're not going to win militarily. But he has been kind of brought in on the secret a little bit by Gandalf, so that he knows more or less what the plan is, and so he knows that his role is, though important, relatively small, and we get the sense that he accepts that. Denethor, of course, is the other way around. Denethor is so proud that he will tell Gandalf, you're not going to bring any upstart to be king in Gondor. You may be wise, but for all your wisdom, you have not all subtleties. Denethor is kind of like the classic arrogant character. And that's not to say that he is as bad as he is in the movies, because in the movies he's depicted as both arrogant and dumb. In the book, he's arrogant but very smart in his own way. He has his own kind of wisdom and a lot of it, but he has allowed his own pride to lead him to a point where Sauron has basically deceived him into thinking victory is completely impossible, and therefore by the end of his story, he completely despairs and commits suicide, which is in a weird way, oddly parallel, but also opposite to Theoden, because Theoden, in a sense, commits suicide in that his reckless charge is, part of what leads to his own death. And that's just kind of the way the Rohirrim are. They kind of go into berserk mode a little bit. But the point being, his is not out of despair. That is we're going to go out and do what we can and go down in a blaze of glory. Whereas Denethor goes out in a blaze of ignominy. So there's, again, that kind of opposite but parallel thing going on there. But Denethor's whole trajectory is, he is proud from the start, and he never recovers from that. He only gets worse and worse as time goes on, until eventually he's like, I'm not going to live in a world where I can't be the boss. And that's, there's not many ways you can be more proud than that. Another really good parallel type of example is, speaking of Gandalf and Saruman. And the key difference between the two of them is indeed humility and pride, because Saruman, most of his downfall can be attributed to the fact that he got a little too big for his boots and decided that he was going to be the man. And not only was he going to be the man, he was going to be the king of everybody if he could help it. And Gandalf, on the other hand, is completely the opposite. Unlike Saruman, who decides, I'm going to set up in the Tower of Orthanc in Isengard, which is awesome and makes me like the boss of a whole bunch of people, and now I can have a whole army to myself and all this other stuff, Gandalf never even has a permanent home and wanders around everywhere. Also, just consider the difference in color between the two. Gray is not outstanding as a color choice. It's, if you wanted to be ostentatious and put on a display, gray is, along with maybe brown, the last color choice you would ever pick. White is at least a, shinier, in some sense, type of color. But Saruman doesn't even stick with white, which is in some ways a good color in terms of humility, because it shows that you're not trying to be anything particular. Saruman goes the other direction with it and says, I'm going to be Saruman of many colors because I am going to be a showboat. And he even gets to the point where he fancies himself a ring maker, which means he's basically setting himself up to be Sauron's rival. Not that that turns out too well, because he's just not that good. Gandalf never goes there. He rejects the ring on the grounds that he knows that it's dangerous and it's not safe for him to keep it. Saruman wants exactly the opposite. He thinks that he should have the ring so that he can, basically bring about knowledge, rule, and order, as he tells Gandalf. Which is, if you think about that, that is kind of the classic symptom of somebody you don't want to have power, is the person who wants it so that they can make everything better. Saruman is that guy. He's the guy who thinks that if only they would all listen to me, everything would be fine. Whereas Gandalf is like, that's really not smart. Although Gandalf does tell Denethor, I am also a steward, did you not know? But Gandalf's role as a steward, as he describes it, is not to boss other people around, which is what Saruman wants to do. His role is to tend to people in the way that a gardener might tend to a gardener, parallel with Sam, by increasing in other people their own virtues. This is what he does with Theoden. He turns him around and brings him back to his own kind of sanity. He goes, in the Siege of Minas Tirith, he goes around the walls and, encourages people by his very presence so that they have the courage to resist, both the siege and the terror of the Nazgul above them. This is the kind of person that Gandalf is. His role is not to go out there and be like, you got to do this and you got to do this and this is how we're going to make everything work. His goal is as an advisor and somebody who just literally encourages, puts courage into other people and brings forward their best virtues. Saruman is trying to do the opposite. He's trying to be the top-down, king of everybody else. And that is, again, pride at work. And at the end of the story, Saruman not only dies, he dies in one of the most kind of pathetic ways you can imagine. Saruman is killed by the guy that he basically treated like a dog, and he called him as much. He said cur, called him a cur. And he dies at his hand precisely because he keeps beating up on him and being a petty tyrant. His pride lasts to the very end. He still has to have somebody to boss around, and so he's going to boss around Wormtongue, dang it. And as a result, Wormtongue finally snaps and kills him, and he just dies at the feet of a bunch of hobbits and Wormtongue. Gandalf dies too, in, a completely different way, but he gets brought back and glorified, in a sense, and then ends up being the key player in most of the War of the Ring. And so, again, you see the opposite trajectories. Gandalf is humble for pretty much his entire career, and as a result, he is rewarded is not exactly the right word, but he is at least, let's say, vindicated in the sense that his death at the hands of the Balrog is reversed, and he is brought back to Middle-earth for the purpose of completing his mission, as if to say, yes, you were going the right way about this. Saruman is, he becomes prideful, and then everything from there is just downhill until he finally dies in the dirt. That's classic. You can even go outside Lord of the Rings to see this sort of thing, because you do have some interesting parallels in the Silmarillion. And just to highlight one, let's look at the case of Beren and Turin. Turin, of course, has lots of things that we could say about him. One of them is definitely that he is a bit on the prideful side. He does not like to take advice. He does not like to have things go any way other than his own way. And as a result, he kind of just tends to make all the decisions in his life, and a lot of those decisions do not go well, to put it mildly. And as a result of him making all the decisions for himself and just trying to have everything his own way, he ends up leading to the fall of Nargothrond, and just tons of things that go down are all his fault, and they're all disastrous. Beren, on the other hand, he has his moments, whenever he actually stands before Thingol and he's like, I want to marry your daughter, give her to me. He gets a little bit, not exactly uppity, but he certainly is exhibiting a bit of pride in his own lineage, because Thingol kind of denigrates him. He's like, you're just, some thrall from who knows where, and you're not important. And Beren's like, no, I'm actually kind of awesome, thank you. So he has his moments. But overall, Beren is not the kind of guy who is prideful throughout most of his career. He's driven mostly by love. And just, this is not a key thing in his story exactly, the humility element, but there is certainly a sense in which love can't really be properly done in the right way without a good chunk of humility. You can't really love somebody if you're not willing to put them above you in some way, and therefore you can't be the one who is all prideful and arrogant, like, I'm the dude, you should do this for me. No, it's kind of the other way around. You have to say, oh, you're the dude, and I'm going, or lady in this sense, in this particular case, and I'm going to do this for you. And Beren, whenever Thingol gives him the challenge of getting the Silmaril, he says, okay, because he's not going to be a prideful, boastful person and just say, like, I don't need no sticking jewel for your daughter. She loves me, and that's all I need. He accepts the challenge because, that's kind of the thing you do. And then he goes out, and what does he do? He seeks help. And he gets help from Finrod Felagund, who he ends up getting killed through, not because he wanted to, obviously, but Beren's story is much more along the lines of he's trying to get to his goal, obviously, but he's not doing it in a way that is, I know what to do and I'm going to, be the hero. That's not how he goes about it. And in fact, he is willing to risk his mission in order to save Luthien, because when Luthien comes along and tries to help him, he ends up leaving her because he doesn't want her to get hurt. He'd rather risk, going up against Morgoth on his own than, risk her life. So there's elements of humility in there. It's like, it's not my place to risk this other person's life, but also there's the fact that he loves her. But that in and of itself is a point about what I was saying earlier, where true love involves some humility. So Baron's story ends in a great success, and he becomes arguably the greatest hero of men in the First Age, whereas Turin, he is great, but his greatness and his own pride lead to his ultimate downfall in a lot of ways. And so, again, you see the value of not being the arrogant guy who thinks that he can do everything on his own and make all the right decisions. Baron is much more willing to listen to advice and get help. Turin is not. Now I want to look at some of those smaller examples that I talked about, though, because these are the ones where you can really tell that Tolkien is putting this theme into every little last chink in the story. One of these is the Herb Master at the Houses of Healing in Gondor. And this is an example of somebody who is definitely not humble. And as a result, he has no wisdom. Because what happens is, Aragorn, of course, is trying to find Athelas so that he can use it to help heal Merry and Éowyn. And they're all trying to find out if there is any. And so they call the Herb Master, and he says, "Do you have any?" He's like, "No, we don't have any." And he starts just rattling off, factoids about Athelas, or as it's known in this tongue, this or this or this. And Aragorn's like, "I don't care what you call it. Do you have some?" And he's like, "No, we don't know that it has any real uses." And at some point, I don't remember if it's Aragorn or Gandalf, but one of them pipes in and says, "Then find somebody with less lore and more wisdom who has some in his house." And the point is, just because you book learned a bunch of stuff doesn't mean you actually really know what you're talking about. The Herb Master knows lots of lore and data, but he's an idiot and has no wisdom because he has forgotten, along with probably a lot of other people in Gondor, because it's been a long time since they had a king who was worth much. It's been a long time since they had a king at all. They have forgotten that Athelas actually has a lot of value, not just, for curing headaches, as the Herb Master says. And so the wisdom of the low person who just keeps it around because he knows that it has some benefits is greater than the Herb Master who has studied and made a scientific, set of knowledge about this thing and been like, "I've analyzed it and found that there's no value in this." That's the kind of humility that the Herb Master lacks. Is, maybe in all the old tales that have been handed down, there is truth that I can't get out of my book learning. Because sometimes that's the way wisdom gets passed down. As Celeborn says when he's talking about Fangorn, he says, "Careful, because old wives may contain some truth in them." And we should be wise and humble enough to accept the fact that what people have passed down for centuries may be more valuable than just a story for children. On the other side of this spectrum, the more humble type characters, we have a couple of people that I want to bring up. One of them is Farmer Maggot. Farmer Maggot is humble in the sense that he's a farmer. He's not, the Thane of the Shire. He's not the Master of Buckland. He's not rich, famous, or whatever. But one of the things that we learn from Tom Bombadil is that he is quite significant in his own way. And in fact, very, let's say he knows a lot of things, and he is also one of the most courageous of the hobbits. I mean, he faces down some black riders and tells them off. But he's actually very important, and the hobbits, in talking to Bombadil, come to realize that Farmer Maggot's actually a bit of a thing, even though it's not really obvious that he is. But that's the thing. When you're humble, you don't go out and just blare the fact that, "Oh, look, I know this, I know these people, I can do these things." You don't advertise all that, and Farmer Maggot doesn't advertise all that. Yet he is quite important, apparently, in a lot of ways. The fact that he even knows Tom Bombadil is a huge deal. And so there's that level of importance. But the one that I want to end on And this is actually the one that kind of made me think of the topic, because I read the line and I was like, man, that is actually a really cool point. I'm thinking here of Barlam and Butterbur, and you might be wondering, why on earth Barlam and Butterbur? Now again, this is not one where you can just see humility dripping off the character, but Barlam and Butterbur is basically his own guy. He's just, he's the innkeeper in a family of innkeepers, and that's what he does. Now, you can see bits of humility because he will admit his own faults. He basically will just straight up say, like, I don't have a good memory. And he will be very apologetic about it. He kind of uses it as a bit of an excuse, but he also is just honestly admitting, I'm not the kind of guy that is great at this sort of thing. So he has some elements of humility, but the main thing here I want to focus on is the fact that he doesn't pretend to be anything more important than he is. He's just the innkeeper at the biggest inn in Bree, and that's his job, and that's what he does, and there you go. Now, Frodo, whenever he talks to Gandalf in Rivendell, will say, they're talking about Aragorn at one point, and he's saying that Aragorn is really different than what I thought most big people were like. I thought they were either stupid and evil or stupid and kind. And his example of a stupid and kind person is Butterbur. And Gandalf reprimands him and says, I don't think he uses exactly the word stupid, maybe he does, but whatever the word is, Gandalf retorts it back to him and says, you're kind of the stupid one if you think Butterbur is stupid. He says he's wise enough on his own ground, and he can, as they say in Bree, see through a brick wall in time. And Gandalf here is basically telling Frodo, don't knock down people that you think are beneath you, because they may actually be a little more than you think. Butterbur is not actually an idiot. He's smarter than he seems. Just because he's run off his feet with his job and doesn't have the best memory in the world, he can put two and two together and actually, see through a brick wall, as he says. And when I read that again, I had this thought of, isn't that just a perfect example of teaching humility? It's not so much that Butterbur is super humble and gets exalted. Gandalf here is teaching Frodo a lesson about humility, because what he's doing is saying, just because you might be better at something than this other person doesn't make you a better person than them, and you shouldn't look down on them on those grounds. You should be humble and recognize this person is, maybe flawed in some ways, but you know what? So am I. And we should all recognize our own flaws and be willing to accept the fact that others have flaws that are just different than our own. And we shouldn't assume that because they have this or that flaw, that they are therefore, as in this case, it could be a number of different things, but Frodo assumes because of Butterbur's flaw in his, not having a great memory, that he is stupid. And Gandalf is saying, no, just because he has a bad memory doesn't mean he's stupid. If you give him time to think, he can actually, he can be pretty smart when he wants to be. And we actually see that in the story, because we do see that Butterbur does put two and two together and gets the fact that Frodo is, in fact, Baggins. And he's, he puts together the fact that he's in trouble and that he needs help. That's not the only thing, probably, that he ends up putting together by the end of it, because also when we come back at the end of the story, he says, I don't think we realized how much good the Rangers did for us. He puts two and two together there, too. He's not an idiot. He's maybe slow, but he's not an idiot. And he's only slow in part because of all the things that he has to do. And that's the other thing. Humility is recognizing that some people's faults aren't necessarily due just to their own inherent weakness of character. It might be due to circumstance. If Butterbur weren't, the innkeeper and constantly run off his feet, would he, be better at remembering to send that note to Frodo? Maybe. Circumstances dictate sometimes what we can and can't do, and, how that affects us in all kinds of ways. So Gandalf is teaching Frodo this lesson of don't don't think that you're better than other people just because you don't have this one particular issue that they have. And I think that is a really good example of how to be humble is recognize you have your own flaws and that everybody else has their own flaws and none of us are identical. We don't have the same problems. And just because other people's problems aren't the same as yours doesn't make you better. Your problems are just as bad in their own way. So we should all just kind of stop acting like we are the standard by which other people are measured, because that really is pride. So that is a look at how Tolkien exalts the humble and, well, let's just say humbles the proud. So that was something that I thought was really interesting, and I think it's also a particularly worthwhile topic to explore here at the Christmas season this year. If you're watching this when it's released, this is the Monday after Christmas 2024. Did you enjoy this? Can you think of other really good examples in Tolkien of this kind of theme playing out? Leave them in the comments below. Discuss all that fun stuff. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up and share it around. Subscribe on whatever platform you're watching me to catch all my future content. And if you're on YouTube, make sure you click the bell icon so that you don't miss any notifications for future releases. Follow me on the platform formerly known as Twitter to get Tolkien-related trivia questions every week. And check the description below for other support and social links. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially elf friends Nathan Dufour, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.